And tonight, I'm starting it off. It's just going to be a little journey around motivational interviewing. And just to kind of give you my goal, certainly I know in all the surveys we do, when everybody reports what I've been exposed to, the most frequently endorsed kind of idea of intervention or treatment modality is motivational interviewing. So it's out there in the culture and it's out there in all different ways. And I'm sure everyone's experience with it is quite varied. So not necessarily going to be a motivational interviewing workshop, but I'd love to walk and journey with you about the bigger kind of historical context of where it grew out of. How was it different? How did it position itself differently? How does it help us and ask us to think about motivation? And then we can also, tie it to some of the ways you've been exposed to it in the ITC or in other domains in your travels. So really a starting point to just see where it grew from and a little bit of what it is, and open up the idea for more discussion. For me, my interest in a lot of it is it asks me to think about the history by which we view human motivation, where human interactions can influence that process, and certainly helps paint the backdrop of why this seemed like such a different radical way of thinking about helping when it started to kind of come out into the world and make its presence known. So those are some of the things I hope to touch on tonight. Give you some of the nuts and bolts of, if you lift the motivational interviewing hood up, what does it look like on a nuts and bolts perspective, and then again open up some discussion points. So feel free to use your chat if you've got questions, and certainly would love and we'll love to hear all your points of view. I thank you, Lila, for putting that in there. I'm curious, and you can put in the chat, has anyone been to a formal MI training? And when we think of that, it's like, oh, hey, I signed up for this 2-day workshop. It's like 16 hours. That's just about motivational interviewing in as a standalone. So yeah, I'm wondering if you can kind of put a thumbs up, or, okay, Paula, yes, thanks, okay. Okay, Patrick, years ago. Emery, yes. Michelle, Paula. Kelly, yes. Patricia, through ASAM, okay. Oh, Paula, twice. Okay, you come around. Okay, and Paula and Bob Myers, who certainly was in that camp over in Albuquerque, where a lot of this started to come out of in CASA. Okay, so some people have this. So I'm glad I'm not reproducing that. So that I'm glad in that sense. There's no way to cram in 45 minutes a workshop, but it's really cool to know, that people have rolled their sleeves up and have kind of interacted with it. So some of this will be review. Hopefully, some of it will be a little different in terms of historical context, and just fill in some of the background around your experience in workshop. And Susan, you have the book as well. Yeah. All right. I'm going to jump into slides and then we'll be jumping back out. But hopefully that's the bummer for me, because I get to lose sight of all my colleagues here when I'm talking, or it narrows down. So let me kind of go there. Okay, well, I think I know most of you. I've had the opportunity to walk with most of you in all our training workshops, but the formal introduction, Ken Carpenter, trained as a clinical psychologist, and kind of fell into motivational interviewing in a secondary way. So just to let you a little bit know about where I'm coming from with it, I wasn't trained in it in graduate school. I had an interest in it just because of some of Bill Miller's earlier writings around motivation. And most of my clinical work and clinical training was always in the area of substance use disorders. That's kind of where I did all my internships and clinical learning. And I was trained in a bunch of different therapeutic approaches. So I had all this knowledge of different ways of helping people change. CBT is cognitive behavior therapy, other kind of treatment modalities. But was always curious because Bill Miller always talked a little differently about how to go about helping people. And I'll dive into that a little bit. But the clients that I worked with actually piqued my interest in motivational interviewing most because they often were telling me this is what my struggles are. This is where my motivation is. This is what I'm open to hearing. This is not where I'm at and opening to hearing that. So always sitting in that context was the first belief of this is what I have to offer. This is what psychologists do. But then yet in the context of a conversation, people telling me, but this is what I'm looking for. And it forced me to start to think differently about the conversations I was having, what the struggles that people were having when they wanted to change, even when they were coming to treatment saying, things aren't working for me and my relationships with substances aren't helpful. So that kind of back and forth started to just shape the lenses of there must be different ways than in interacting with people. And also ask the question, which is, as a helper, what is my role in the process of change? Right? Graduate school could tell me one way, you're either an expert or you have important information or you have skills to impart on people or you have knowledge that you're going to hand over. That's what you're bringing to the table. But in the actual work, often that might not necessarily be what people wanted, nor times after a day of working, I would think, is that actually what my role is here? What is that? What's a way to understand that? So motivational interviewing kind of started to pique my interest as I learned more about it. And then I had a little bit of a research career with M.I., and that was a deeper dive in trying to learn different ways to help people learn it. And that was another way that I got involved in deepening my understanding what MI is, how do you go about learning it, and challenges with it. And then certainly my recent collaborations at CMC and with my colleagues there, thinking even more broadly about this, which is if we're talking about these ideas of how to have conversations, how to help, certainly has influenced thinking in terms of the ITC and the other things that we talk about in this community when it comes to understanding motivation, change, helpful conversations. So it's kind of infused itself in many different facets of my work over time. And we're going to jump into the kind of those questions. I want to put out, just before we get into that, that this quarterly talks is something we're really trying to put out there and share wisdom in the community and open up topical discussions. So I wanted to share some dates where it will be happening in 2024. And the next one will be in April. And right now it's tentatively looks like it will be around trauma and SUDs, substance use disorders, and the impact that that combination can have on individuals and families. Jeff Foote and Carrie Wilkins right now slated to talk about that. And we're in the process of finding topics for the remainder of 2024. But these are going to be our quarterly talks and the schedule for that. And Katie, yes, you have a question?
Hi, Ken. You said April. Is it February or April?
Oh, did I say April?
I thought you did. Maybe I heard you wrong.
No, maybe I could have said that. Thanks for letting me know. No, February 15th.
Okay,
That's it,
awesome.
okay?
Thank you.
And then May, August, and November. So if you have the time, we'll be video taping, but yeah, they're here for our community and just a way for all of us to kind of roll up our sleeves on different topics that could be of interest, and certainly be part of the work you're doing as well. So before starting off, I want to say some of the talk and some motivational interview. There is a 4th edition of the book out. So motivational interviewing hasn't been a static entity. It's been a process of development and collaboration with the Motivational Interviewing network and community, which means, there was always been tweaks and changes to it as data and understanding and the exchange of ideas has happened. So Miller and Rolnick just released their 4th edition of motivational interviewing. So this is kind of the anchoring text that is out there. And I think maybe it's a month or 2 old, where they continually just try to refine the language and the set of lenses. For those that really want to do a deep dive and who haven't had a 2-day workshop, this book is pretty much like their version of the workshop in writing. Worth the read. And for those that have had the workshop, worth the read to see where they have changed or refined some of the ways they're talking about concepts. I've tried to use the language and the set of lenses coming out of the 4th edition. So where there are differences, I'll just highlight that for people who have kind of been exposed to earlier lenses around motivation. I know we can start basic, but I think it's a fundamental idea that we all think about when trying to help people or trying to understand people out. Like, what is this thing called motivation? It's in the culture. We all run into this word. We all think about it and use it in different ways. And certainly it's smack in the middle of the title, motivational interviewing. Yet it can be a tricky concept, and it can be used differently by different people. So I just pulled 3 definitions. If we're starting from square one, which is what is it, you can find it positioned differently. An online dictionary calls it's the general desire, right, or willingness of someone to do something. That's one version of what motivation is. Miller and Rolnick, in the latest version, talks about it being whatever actually gets someone moving, acting, changing, or growing. And there is a learning program out there, and I liked this definition. They define motivation as a process of inducing and stimulating an individual to act in a certain manner. Right? So we've got this construct that everyone hears about. We talk about it. There are motivational speakers. There's tons of books on motivation. It's spoken in so many different ways when we try to understand behavior, and yet it can look and be positioned differently. And the things I just want to highlight for the online dictionary version is motivation is something there that's inside a person, right? That's where it's positioned. It's inside this person. Are they motivated or are they not? It's something that resides in them, comes from them. Miller and Rolnick kind of blow it out a little bit more and talks about, well, they're not really positioning in anything, but they are saying it's a set of conditions or it's something that has the impact of creating some movement from someone, but they didn't locate it anywhere, right? I'm going to ask you to put that in your back pocket when we think about it. The learning program certainly didn't locate it within an individual, but talked about motivation is actually a process. It's something that's going on that's similar to Miller and Rolnick, can impact an individual to move in some direction. So along this continuum, as we talk about motivation, I'm just going to come back to this kind of the real first important thing is where we position it and where it locates it. And how is our language bringing us? It could be something inside an individual. It could be a function of a process or interactions, or it could come in many forms. being outside the individual. And motivational interviewing, as we talk about it, is going to ask us to start to think in terms of motivation not being inherently about being something inside one person, whether they got it or not. But that motivation is actually comes from a process. It comes from interacting with other people or the world. So I want to highlight that because that is a shift often in thinking about what motivation is. Because often and historically, it's been something you either have or you don't. And it's inside your skin. And the motivational interview started to reframe it, not as something that is within an individual, but comes from how the individual is interacting in the world. And some of those, you probably hear that in our ITC when we talk about setting a context for change. So there's a link there. But why should we care about it at all? Why should motivation even be something that we waste our time with, right? Well, I'm just going to throw out some statistics thinking about the process of change. But when we think about in the area, certainly of substance use disorders and struggles with substance use, and one of the more recent SAMHSA epidemiological surveys, and when they ask people who are struggling with substance use disorders, approximately 30% of people who meet criteria for a substance use disorder and say, yes, I think I need treatment. 37% said the reason why they're not getting help is because they're not ready to stop. So yes, I'm having some negative consequences. I'm meeting criteria, and I think I do need to do something about it, but I'm not ready to walk away from it. In a recent kind of big study of treatments, and these treatments are clinical trials, so there's usually a starting point and an end point, like you're in a 15-week study or you're in a 16-week study. But on average, across all substances in clinical trials, approximately 30% never complete psychosocial treatments. Now that varies according to substance, and there's nuance here. But if we just look, at least 1/3 of people who enroll in a clinical trial for help will not get to the end of it. They'll leave before time is up. And John Kelly from Recovery Research Institute has done a big study on the recovery process and looking at quality of life. And based on their estimates, when you look at quality of life, ratings of how people are interacting with their life, for those that have entered recovery, have made some big changes, that when you look at increases to quality of life, on average, it takes up to 15 years for someone who's been struggling with this substance use disorder to be on an equal level of quality life ratings as the general population. Right? So what's this picture painting? People can realize they're having troubles, can see a need for that, yet they're not taking that step. Or people take that step and they start the process of change and then they step out of it. Or people do some heavy lifting and they're making changes in their lives. And it takes time, even in that, for the benefits and the payout, if we think of it in terms of just general population and people that are in recovery. It takes a long period of time for that adjustment to happen. So if we think about motivation, back towards that getting someone moving, acting, changing, or a process, it starts to be like, well, this could be something we should think more seriously about. Can we understand it? Why? Because change doesn't happen fast. It doesn't happen at one shot. It is an ongoing process for people. But understanding that process of change, and if you bear with me on this, the history behind, particularly in the area of substance use disorders, about what motivates people to commit to making change, to stay on that road of change, to taking that step, which is a substantial portion of individuals when they're struggling that way, has itself changed over time. And this is where I'm going to position motivational interviewing in this history of how historically have families, loved ones, and clinicians been taught to think about what motivates that process of change. And William White has this whole tour de force book called Slaying the Dragon. It is a huge volume of work, but it's pretty much the deepest historical dive on how recovery and substance use has been treated and looked at in the history of America. So it's a fascinating read. But one thing in one area of it, he just talks about the historical lenses of understanding what promotes people to want to change substance use. And he kind of highlighted four different views. The first baseline view that really got traction early in the movement was that, you know what? People are not going to be motivated, or motivation doesn't happen until the person says they're ready to change. So if you're not ready to change, you're not motivated. We know you're motivated when you say you're ready to change. But where that grows out of is from the pain of the behavior. When people hurt enough, they will be motivated to make change. Right? So that's kind of where that thinking started is, well, what motivates change? Pain. And what stemmed from that is when people finally get to experience enough pain or they hit bottom, they will then be motivated to make movement. Right? So this was the prism or the set of lenses of this is how people start to want to change. Very focused on the pain of that. And what grew out of that, so if we think about that, that's the message that's out there, right? And we can identify in the ITC training and certainly in other discussions, when we talk about the cultural narratives, we can see how far back they go. Even when we start thinking about, well, how do we help people change? Well, let them experience the pain, right? That's what's got to happen. That started way back when. But then that expanded, right? And that narrative grew and saying, well, yeah, but not everyone experiences that pain. And you know what? That's probably because the people in their lives are protecting them from that. So because they're protecting people from experiencing that pain, they're not going to want to be motivated to stop. So families are inadvertently hurting the motivational process, right? So that idea of enabling started to grow, which is if you're not allowing people to experience the pain, they're not going to be motivated. So families just have to learn to step out of the way. And again, from this prism, if pain is the motivating factor, then that's where you kind of grow, and that makes sense from that perspective. And that was started later on, growing from this baseline view of motivation. Over time, that morphed a little bit. And then there was a little bit more of another viewpoint that started to bleed in, which was that, well, you don't have to let people go all the way down, but you can start using confrontation earlier in the process to accelerate change. We still need to have pain and threat. That's an important part of motivation, but we're just going to try to deliver that a little earlier in the process. So it went from total experiencing pain for motivation to helping and accelerating the process through confrontation. And again, there's a whole history of confrontation in treatments. And it's still out there today, right? Stemming from this historical view of motivation. That's carried on for a lot of history in the treatment and understanding of how people change. But there's been a shift as well. And there's a fourth perspective that is starting to work its way and started to grow, which, well, perhaps if someone's not motivated, It's not that they're not experiencing pain, that there's an absence of pain, but perhaps the reason why people aren't necessarily stepping into the change process is because they don't have hope. That it's not the absence of pain, but it's the absence of hope that is actually causing and derailing some of the motivation to step into that. That changes the set of lenses, because if motivation is influenced by having a vision and hopefulness, then it starts to think differently about relationships, that empowering relationships are actually a critical ingredient in motivation. And that's kind of where we're going to go here, which is 3 of the 4 perspectives were about pain-induced wanting to change. One perspective is about what's the power of relationships and hope. And certainly a critical argument can be, well, hey, Ken, and we talk about science and kindness, what's the evidence say about that? Right? That's often something that's brought up. So I just want to talk a little bit about Bill Miller's journey and how motivational interviewing started to develop. You know, he was a researcher. In some way, he did a lot of research, early research, and he was interested in motivation. So some of the studies, when people say, what's your evidence of what's going on, there were some really interesting things he started to throw out in the world back in the 80s. It started actually a little earlier than that, in the 70s, that started to get him to think differently. One of his studies was he wanted to know what predicted treatment engagement and outcome. That's kind of that motivation, right? We thought, well, even 30% of the people may not see a need for it. And for people in treatment, most people, or a good percentage of people, at least recently, at least 30% leave, right? So he did this whole kind of research on what client characteristics predict dropout. Must be something about the clients, the personalities, other factors. And he did a whole research protocol on that, and he published it. But you know what was interesting, and what he found is he couldn't find consistent client characteristics that predicted treatment dropout. But what he did find was it was the characteristics of the counselors that were more predictive about who completed treatment versus characteristics of the clients. Now we can think back in terms of those definitions of motivation, which is if we think it's something they got, then it's easy to say it must be something about the client. But no, he was finding characteristics such as hostility, expectancy, and empathy. If we measure them from the counselors, those predicted what clients were going to complete. So counselors were bringing more to the table in who's getting to the finish line. And when he did a deeper dive looking at other treatment outcomes, this second study was that all counselors got trained the same. Not all counselors had the same outcomes. And when they started looking at what were the counselors doing who had a greater percentage of people completing treatment, they started seeing counselors that were employing empathic listening skills and that were relating to clients in a non-confrontational way. People were sticking around and engaging in treatment with those counselors. People were leaving treatment for those other counselors. So again, wait a minute, it's not so much about the clients, but how are the counselors stepping into this space? And when they looked at levels of confrontation in counseling sessions, remember, if we go back to those motivational interviewing, that where motivation comes from, well, if I believe you need to experience pain and confrontation, that's going to be my strategy for helping you. But when they actually assessed it and rated it, they found that the higher levels of confrontation we go up with counselors, greater drinking levels were happening with clients. So the more counselors confronted, the more their clients drank. So it was actually having the very opposite effect of why people were coming to them in the first place, was to try to step away from their drinking. So before MI even started, he was finding these findings, which started to think about, well, we really got to look at how a counselor is doing their job here. What's the process there? And he was entertaining these ideas as he was doing this research. And in his early days, he started listening more to people, and he was working in the VA system and noticed he was just interested in understanding their stories, which was a different way than what other counselors were doing in more confrontational approaches. But in 1977, he was asked to go to a clinic in Norway, and the students really got on him, which was, well, what are you doing? What made you ask that question? What were you thinking when you said that? Why did you kind of listen there instead of saying this? And it kind of forced him, in his own words, to start thinking about, what am I actually doing? And that started his writing to start to write about, this is how I'm going about counseling in this way. So that's where MI started to grow out of these early writings of him being asked, how is he interacting with people? And that was happening at the same time. He was finding research saying what counselors do is sometimes more important than characteristics of those who are coming for help. So in a couple other highlights before we jump in, he did that writing in 1977, and it was more about his approach and style. In 1989, he was working in Australia and met Steve Rolnick, another provider who was working, I believe at the time in South Africa. But Steve Rolnick liked what Steve Miller, that's my musical interest coming up here, but what Bill Miller was writing about, and he took his approach and started using it in his own work. But Steve Rolnick kind of told Dr. Miller, hey, what I'm finding this really helpful for, and I think what you should really be focusing on here, is I find ambivalence as being one of the biggest factors in working with people, that they can want change and also want to stay the same at the same time. And I think the way you're talking about having conversations can be really helpful and should really focus on this idea of ambivalence. So in around this time in 89, Bill Miller's focus of the importance of how counselors are doing their work was starting to also be laid over on this important concept of ambivalence. And certainly, in our talks in the ITC and others, those concepts become critically central. But that emergence, or that interaction, is where MI started to focus on the importance of ambivalence. In the mid-90s, we'll talk about the technical skills, but in the mid-90s, they also wanted to, their writing has shifted more to the spirit than the technical skills, and I'll talk about that more. But back to that early research, the relationship is everything. How people experience interactions with those that are trying to help is just a fundamental anchoring point in empowering and instilling hope and helping people on that very long journey that we talked about of the change process. So the evidence points away from an over-reliance on confrontational, hitting hard, pain-based ideas of motivation. And as we just saw some here, well, Ken is being a counselor who cares or doesn't take that hard approach. What's the science? Well, there is a lot out there. And it comes down to just looking at outcomes. And that started back in the 80s. It's taken a while for some of that to find its way into cultures. And it hasn't negated the other narratives that are out there when it comes to this thing called motivation and how it comes. And you can still see it. And we talk about it in our trainings when we all share ideas. Right? These narratives are still out there, this view of what motivates. And sometimes it's a little mixture, right? Sometimes things that people, if they're experiencing things that are not working for them, that can be motivation. But here's the nuance, that it's the helping relationships and it's the broader perspective of what promotes change. That's a step away from some of those early narratives. So as this thing developed and formalized from 90s, motivational interviewing has come to be a way of helping people and sitting with people when they're trying to make change. And what is it then? So we talked about some of the research that led to it and some of the historical. Well, there's two ways we can define it. There's the big definition. I always kind of think about this as the conversations at my Thanksgiving table when I'm sitting with family members and they're like, "What do you do?" And I try to explain what I do. Well, sometimes I look at motivation or we study motivation. Well, what is that? Well, this first definition, I think, really captures it. Well, we try to have collaborative conversations, having a style of talking collaboratively to help strengthen a person's own motivation and commitment to change. That catches the definition in the big picture way of what is this thing called motivational interviewing. They're just collaborative conversational styles. But notice they're strengthening a person's desire to want to make change. So there's two things going on. It's an interaction between two people that's focused on helping people grow or move in a direction. I'm talking to some of my colleagues and I want to put some psychological kind of twists on that definition. Another way of thinking about it is MI is a person-centered counseling method for addressing the common problem of ambivalence about change. It's not getting rid of the conversations. That's ultimately what we're doing, but it's also saying I'm really coming from the point of looking at what's in the best service of the person I'm talking with, seeing them in their entirety. And yes, opening up and making room for the fact that they may be two minds about what direction they want to go in. And that's where that ambivalence comes in. So what is ambivalence? Well, situation where a person wants to make a behavior or lifestyle change and is reluctant or ambivalent to do so. And again, the ITC, we talk about that. This is just seen as a fundamental process in making change. It's not a sign that something's wrong. It's not a sign that things are going backwards. It's just if you're going to make change and it's with a behavior that's serving a purpose for you, you're probably going to be ambivalent about it in some way, in some form. That's the operating assumption of motivational interviewing. Right? And for a lot of people here, there's just different ways to think about ambivalence, but I just wanted to highlight it is assumed to be common. It's not pathological. It's not a resistance. It's just a common process of change, but it can pull for the fixing or what used to be called the writing reflex. So that's a version for a change in the language of motivation. They've switched from writing to fixing, but certainly to pull, to tell or persuade or push someone in a direction or try to make things right. And that approach is certainly where counselors can get pulled away from the stance of that person-centered idea of a collaborative process for change. But before we go on, I also want to say what motivation is not. And as a motivational interviewing trainer, there's a lot of narratives out there. Hey, Ken, teach me MI so I can get this person to take their meds. Hey, Ken, can I learn MI because I want them to sign up for this gym class? Well, I want them to do this. So motivational interviewing is not a set of techniques or strategies to get people to do what you want them to do. And that's important to hold on to, because nothing in motivational interviewing, there is nothing in any of the writings that says this can manufacture motivation that is not there in some way for a person. So ambivalence is important. We can talk, we can plant seeds, but what we're not going to do is it's not a magic bullet to make someone motivated or to get them to do something that they're inclined or is totally inconsistent with their values. But it is a way to help grow that, to nurture it, to plant seeds. Okay, so just a couple of things. Hopefully this pace is okay for everybody. Um, why should we care about MI as an intervention strategy or as a way of thinking about things? There's tons of studies out there. So this comes back to the science and kindness. Hey, where's the science, Ken, for kindness here? Is there any out there? Well, yeah, if we think about how relationships can be impactful and how we can operate in this way, there's tons of studies over decades showing that it can help put scaffolding and help promote change when people are ambivalent. That's more than does better than just advising or informing. So it's more impactful than just that. It can be helpful in other skills-based interventions. I want to learn how to handle my anxiety, but I'm really ambivalent of treatments for it. And if we operate from a motivational interviewing perspective, that may make space for someone then to commit to other skills-based interventions and learning different ways of going about that. And it's also from Miller and Rolnick's perspective, it can also be a standalone style. And that's really their message. This can be a style of how you interact with people. And NIAAA, NIH have funded huge tax-paid protocols looking at how it works in relation to other treatments. There was one historical study done in 1997, Project Match, where they were really interested in different treatment programs. So they looked at a 4-session motivational enhancement therapy, says giving people feedback and having motivational interviewing style discussions about that feedback. They also had a 12-week CBT program and a 12-week 12-step facilitation program. And they wanted to see, do different people benefit from different approaches? And is any one particular approach better than the other? And is often in a lot of outcome studies for treatments. All three did similarly. Client matching really didn't matter. But the thing around the motivational interviewing is there was only 4 interactions. And on average, people made as big changes as people who were in 12 weeks of ongoing counseling. So the right kind of conversation in the right context can promote change. For some people, that can happen with lighter touches. So the rationale's there, touch that there's evidence, there's science there, but what is MI then? If we lift up the hood on that with all these writings and when we go to workshops, and for all of you that have been in workshops, this is kind of where we land. And MI really consists of 2 major components. The first important one from all that research was the relational component. How a counselor is viewing the people and the relationship they're having with the people they're trying to help. So that's the context in which the work is done. And then there are the conversational strategies that you've all been exposed to and will come to. But how can a counselor use their verbal tools, their communication strategies in a way to interact? So we've got the relational component and the technical component. So I highlighted before, Bill Miller and Steve Rolnick will say the relational component really carries the biggest weight. And there's actually a whole bunch of studies on empathic listening, which is some of the technical skills, but the importance of relationships in and of itself, it's not a neutral thing. But MI really challenges everybody to think about the dimensions of a relationship. And I'm just going to run through what that how they define the relational components. And when we do these workshops, I think it's important, and even for me in my work, to check back in. What are the assumptions I have when I'm sitting there in this role of helper? And of course, that role can be different for everybody, but MI asks us to think about it in certain terms. One, it sees the process of change as being a partnership. Right? And a couple of things just to highlight here compared to some of the other narratives. That the person's an expert in themselves. that when we sit down with someone, they actually have expertise in their circumstances and their journey and themselves. And that's critically important in making room for. Not always the case historically. If you're struggling, you must not have the expertise, right? You have to listen to people who do. But MI asks us not to think that way. In the relationship, can we make room for a person and seeing a person of having expertise, seeing that they do have strengths and capabilities already that they're bringing to the table? And for some people, they may be hearing the affirmation or skills, and that's certainly part of this. But do we see the strengths people have, even when they're struggling? And that any conversation we have is an active collaboration between two people, each person bringing expertise. In the context of seeing someone as an expert in themselves, do we really acknowledge the fact that people have inherent worth? I say that because historically that wasn't the case. There are certain people that need to be rebuilt, torn down, but they may not be seen as having initial or inherent worth. But stems from that is the respect, the inherent worth, an active interest in the person. If you have worth and I respect you and you have expertise in yourself, I want to be curious in what your take is on things. What's your perspective on things? Help me understand you. Right? That's part of that relational part of acceptance. And it doesn't mean I have to agree with you. Doesn't mean I have to approve. I can accept that the way you see things is different than the way I see things. But if I'm operating in the spirit, the relational spirit of MI, there's an acceptance of your perspective. So we have acceptance, we have worth, collaboration. Compassion is the fourth ingredient to the relational components. And actually in MI studies, they rate therapists on all these dimensions just as a way of quantifying it because they take it seriously. They really want to see how people are putting this into play. But compassion means the intention is always to the well-being and the priority of the person you're working with. Or works in the service of where you want to go in your journey. That our work together is to alleviate suffering in a way, not to take it away, not to make it disappear, but this idea that we're going to work with you in the direction you want to go. And yes, there is a sense of wanting to grow and help you bring different things into your life. But it's your agenda, not mine. And that compassion's opposite that stance of, you're going to do what I want you to do. That's what this is about. It's not about, I want to support you in your journey. I want to help you clarify the direction you want to go because of the reasons that are important for you to go there. And our conversations can help make that stronger for you, particularly if you're in a state of ambivalence. And this is new to MI version 4. They used to talk about evoking. That's there. It's been restructured to talk about empowerment. But they really, the version here is we want to help people utilize and realize their own strengths and abilities. That much of what people need to make change, they have already got. That is an assumption in MI. And the job of conversations is to help bring that out as a starting point. Certainly, if people need to learn new things, there's room for that, but we don't start there. As opposed, you don't have what you need, and I need to give you that. The operating assumption is opposite. I'm going to start with, I think you probably have a lot of strengths that can be helpful to you. My job is to help you connect with that and bring that to light. And respect your autonomy and your ability to make those choices. So those are the 4 critical dimensions of the relational construct in MI. And none of the communication strategies we'll talk about are as impactful if they're occurring outside of these four dimensions of empowerment, compassion, acceptance, and partnership. I really kind of, MI puts a lot of emphasis on that. This is what they're hoping that collaborative effort to feel like and be experienced by individuals seeking help. And their words, it's not always easy. And I think this is the part here that constant checking in with ourselves as helpers, because there are circumstances and times and the types of relationships we have where certain dimensions of this come fairly easily, and other times when they can be more challenging. And that can change whether I have a clinician role, and I'm talking as a clinician, but I know as a parent, the idea of autonomy has changed, and the challenges with that when I interact with my kids. There is autonomy, and yet my role as a parent puts a different kind of context around my interaction with you than when I'm sitting in a room working with clients, per se. So it's the reminding of that. It's checking in. What parts of this come easily? Which parts of the situation that I should just be paying more mindfulness to and check in with myself around? Well, if we've established the relational components and practice, then it comes down to them, they call the technical components, which in the ITC trainings we've all had, you see where that's in the communication skills. These skills can be found, I'll highlight a couple other places. So they're not unique to MI, but they are conversational skills. And that's where the yours comes from. Ultimately, what we're asked to do when conversing and interacting, we lean on four types of ways of having conversations. The use of open questions versus closed, looking for strengths and highlighting strengths by using affirmations. And that allows me to let people know I see the strengths you have, the things you're doing, I see the complete you. Reflective listening versus telling, directing, or questioning. And summary statements, which are a way of checking in with people that I understand you versus just speaking through a conversation and not coming back and checking with the person to see if I'm hearing you the way you want to be heard. Right. So these are the conversational components that are in these workshops that we talk about that are transportable, but yet they are the nuts and bolts of how conversations sound. This is what clinicians are using in their conversations. And certainly offering information and advice is not negated. A collaborative relationship means there are two perspectives, but as we covered in the ITC and others, there's ways of offering information and advice that can help reduce defensiveness and keep a collaborative spirit. So it's another way of clinicians learning how to do that. Since this isn't a MI training workshop, I just wanted to highlight for those of you who have gone through them, this is old news, but just what do they look like, these OR skills? And as we say, open questions invite curiosity. How and what questions? They're not closed questions, right? They can't be answered yes or no. Clinicians are encouraged. If they're going to ask questions, 90% of their questions should probably track to be open questions. That's a metric that's out there. Affirmations are acknowledging strengths, not seeing the person as being deficient of something, but can we also help shift our perspective to see things that we admire, appreciate, and our strengths, and acknowledge that very explicitly for a person so they know they can be seen that way. And reflections, which are a harder skill to learn, and any any person practicing, and we did that in the ITC workshop. It's a very unnatural way of having conversations when no one really learns how to talk this way. Yet they can be particularly helpful. And when practiced, there's a way of just being able to stay with the person when they're talking, and a person gets to hear themselves talk out loud. So someone could say something as, I can't stand this anymore. And a reflection could sound like, you're really frustrated, or you just want things to change. So those are examples of how a reflective statement would be offered based on what person A is saying. And it keeps the focus on what person A is saying. It's not me inserting my opinion. It's not me advising you, telling you, not me taking control of the conversation. It's me telling you, I'm walking with you, I'm hearing what you're saying, and I'm letting you kind of hear yourself talk out loud. And summaries are just ways of checking in and offering a collection. But when you hear and see motivational interviewing practice, the things that will stand out are the use of these 4 verbal skills, heavily leaning on that, and the relational components and how you see a counselor operating and interacting with those that they're talking. The idea of offering information or advice, again, that's something that you learn along the way. We all go to workshops and we all go to learning things and read books on things and practice things. So the information, we hope, is useful to offer other people when they may be looking for guidance. Motivational interviewing has just, in that style, asked clinicians to think about kind of different ways of packaging it. Sometimes it's talked about as ask, offer, ask. But before, and this is more in the medical profession, hey, if I want to kind of have a conversation with you about your hypertension, before I start talking to you about hypertension, let me ask you what you know about it first. So that's the ask. And I can offer what information I have, and then I can come back and ask what your thoughts are about that. It's also known as explore, offer, explore. The explore, offer, explore will be in a book I'll highlight at the end, which is a book on how to have conversations with teenagers. But we're going to have conversations before we go into advising role or telling role. Let me explore what you know about it. What are your thoughts about this thing before I start offering? Then I can offer. Then I can explore what your take on it. In the ITC, you get a taste of that in the information sandwich, which is another way we've talked about it. But all the offering, the information is sandwiched in the middle between getting the other person's perspective. And here are some questions that are developed and counselors are asked to think about. Why are we doing this? Well, we know those early research studies when counselors were just telling, advising, confronting, the very opposite behaviors were occurring and people weren't listening. So how can we help information be part of conversations at times, but in ways that might be more likely to be taken up, heard, and collaborated around? And here are some questions, we talked about in our ITC training. How can I be helpful? Would it be okay? What have you tried already? What are your thoughts about what I just said? Or how does it fit with the thoughts you already have on this? All ways or questions that can be used around the information. And who knows, when we sit with our internists, we may start to see this more frequently, because that's the goal of medical schools, is in brief medical interactions, how can we be asked about our view on what's going on with us prior to being informed or instructed? Some nuance I'm going to just highlight here. Well, okay, Ken, we've talked about the ors, we've talked about the relational skills. You're having conversations with people, you're trying your best to be collaborative, compassionate, you're using reflective listening. Where am I headed with this? So, on a more nuanced level, there are 4 tasks of motivational interviewing conversations. All the ors and relational skills carry throughout. But when we think about conversations, the journey is the task of engaging, which really at its fundamental core is this first question. We're sitting together. Can we walk together? Can there be a partnership here? So my goal is to engage. I want to answer that question. Will you let me walk with you? Will you be willing to walk with me? If that question is a yes and we're moving together, the conversation starts to move like, okay, as we're walking, where are we going? Where do you want to head to? So focusing in a task in motivational interviewing is helping in these conversations to help people just get a direction of where they want to go. You may be ambivalent. What's the direction that's most meaningful to you? And as you start to get clarification on that, then I want to really know why. Why do you want to go there? So that task of MI is more officially called evoking. That's where I want to hear you. I want to invite you to tell me, why are we going there? What's important about it? In ITC, we start thinking about willingness and values. Why would you want to go there? Why are you willing to go there? What are your values? What's important about it? And in that part of the conversation, that's where our job as counselors and conversationalists is to give the microphone to the change voice a person has. Tell us why you want to go. And if our conversation keeps going and we're walking together and you're telling us where we're going and why you want to go there, then at some point we can start talking about how do you want to get there? That's the planning phase of a conversation. There's nothing different about the relational and the nuts and bolts of the technical skills. But when we're having conversations, these are kind of the 4 tasks of a conversation over time when we're sitting with someone who may be ambivalent. Can we do this together? Where do you want to head? Why would you want to go there? And how are you going to get there? And let's work together on all of that. When we're listening to people talk and answer those questions, another nuanced part of motivational interviewing, and there's a whole literature on this, is are we listening to how people are talking? Because if I'm advising, I'm telling, and I'm talking, then my listening, I might not be tracking how you're talking about things. So this is a real busy slide. And you've heard about this in terms of red lights and green lights. Is the talk about movement and making change, and we're walking together in the green light? MI calls this change talk. And a deeper dive on that is people talk in all kinds of ways. They can tell us their desire to change, how they want to do that, how they can do it, the reasons why they want to make change, and even times the need that they might have to make change. And this is called preparatory change talk. And why it's preparatory is because this language by itself does not always mean change is going to happen. But it's a great temperature that ambivalence is being resolved. If I'm giving you reasons why I want to make change and how come it's important and my belief that I could possibly do this. But it sets the stage for people to start to think and talk about making commitments, experimenting for making change, taking small steps, contemplating action. And that's called mobilizing change talk. Not to get lost in the weeds here, the invitation really when we think about MI is if I'm listening to a person talk, I want to be very much in tuned to how they're talking about making change. Am I hearing commitment language? Am I hearing preparatory change talk? The idea on the metric on the bottom is in research studies, they code client language and give it numbers. And the strength of this language can vary from a 1, which is, yeah, I guess I'd like to, versus I definitely want to. That's both desire talk, but if we're listening to that, it sounds much different to us because the definitely want to is a stronger change talk phrase than that. Not that we can track this in our conversations, this is a lot, but what I do want to point that green lights and motivational interviewing is how people are talking. Am I hearing their change talk? Am I asking questions about it? Am I reflecting it? Am I inviting people to talk more about it? Because it's this kind of talk, mobilizing change talk, that has predicted behavior change up to a year out. And that's kind of where that research goes, is how do counselors impact change talk and how does change talk impact behavior change? And the research, as we talked about, counselors make a difference in how people talk about and commit to change. And when people are talking that way and have the space to do that, it impacts their behavior. But Ken, not everybody gives change talk. Not every conversation feels like someone wants to make change. And just a note on the historical idea of resistance. Resistance was the earlier way that if someone's not willing to make changes and motivation is just in them, they must not want it. They're resistant. We have to break through their resistance. We need to be forceful. So the concept of resistance has been around for a while and factors into those early historical ways of thinking about motivation. But MI asks us to think differently about it, that there is nothing really called resistance. We want to take that word out of the vocabulary, that when we're sitting and having conversations with people and they're not necessarily voicing change, or they're kind of digging their heels in, or they're giving us red lights, if we want to use that one. Could be one of two things. It could be my relational components. There's discord here between me and the person I'm talking to. The MI spirit isn't set. They're seeing me as an adversary, not a partner. Or the relationship could be okay, but there's ambivalence and I'm just hearing sustained talk in this conversation. So there's two kind of ways that this old word resistance has been reformulated to. It's either one or two things, discord, or it could be both. But it orients us differently, right? Sustained talk's just about the behavior. So the person's ambivalence about making change, or the person's expressing some snag in the relationship. But if I'm hearing those red lights and I'm thinking about what's generating that, it helps me just navigate the conversation a little differently. Because both discord and sustained talk are very responsive to how I respond to it as a counselor. So do I need to go back and try to repair, so to speak, or be more collaborative, or look at the relationship here? Why are they seeing me as an adversary? Or am I just hearing this side of ambivalence about the behavior, the reasons why I can't change? So that sustained talk is the same thing, but on the other side of the other fence. People can give me desires, ability, reasons, and needs for why they don't want to talk or why they don't want to make change. And I can hear that, and I can use my OR skills to respond to that. And that is in the motivational interviewing tasks. That's often what counselors are instructed and learn how to do. I can use reflective listening to sustain talk. I can use open questions to explore it. I can still use an affirmation to show appreciation. I'm just responding to just that side of the ambivalence. Sustain talk predicts less change. So that's also come out of the research. If you have sessions where people are high engaging and sustained talk, they're not likely to make change. But if we confront it, it actually gets stronger. So that's where people then can start to dig in and actually go in a direction they might be ambivalent about. So the use of the order skills, and we talked about this in the ITC, and recognizing ambivalence is just because we hear sustained talk, that doesn't mean we have to change our use of any of those conversational skills. They still come into play. The thing we just want to be careful, and counselors want to be careful of based on the data, is that switching gears to be confrontational and hostile just increases sustained talk and leads to discord, the other part that we're here, which is now the relationship is adversarial. And we know adversarial relationships in those early studies yielded worse outcomes. So how can we come back to repair the discord, which could be, I want to partner with you. Let's get back to thinking about how we got on different pages. And how can I respond to your sustained talk in a way that doesn't push you further down that road? So the nuts and bolts of MI is the relationship, factoring on the science that says our ways of relating and interacting matter, depending on the hats that we wear. The counselor hats was the research I shared with you, but in human interactions, this also comes into play. Motivational interviewing as a style is asking us to think about those 4 dimensions, thinking about those conversational skills, and walking with people to help them get clarity and stronger connection to the whys they want to move in that direction. And it's really leaning on both the relational space and the communication skills. Now, it's a practice. And that was also that component in the ITC. Counselors don't readily do this, and it takes time and effort, even for counselors, to incorporate these skills often on a consistent way. We're human beings, and we're stepping into challenging circumstances. But the nice thing is you can learn it. And as I come to a close here, I just want to highlight, I was talking about motivational interviewing as a clinical practice, as an orientation embedded in a historical journey of how we think about motivation and what the science of relationships tell us about helping change, and how that grew and created the fertile ground for this approach to develop and come into play. Yet I want to highlight different ways all of these ideas are making their way in the world, not just in the motivational interviewing 4th edition version of this, but certainly in the Beyond Addiction workbook I'll put out. We certainly incorporate these ideas and where the science is coming from when it comes to helping people think about the process of change and communication and stepping in a relationship way that's consistent, their values. For those that want other reads, this Lighthouse Conversations book is actually just a motivational interviewing version of conversations between parents and teens. So everything we talked about, you will see embedded there, and overlap too when it comes to values and in other ways. But this is just kind of a parent book. Finding Your Way to Change is a self-help book for anybody who's thinking, and I am ambivalent about this. Alan Zarkoff has this book that's just kind of a walkthrough workbook to wrestle with ambivalence. So it's not a treatment, but it's a way of thinking about ourselves as human beings and whatever things we want to change in a guided motivational interviewing way. Bill Miller has offered 2 books on Second Thought, which is his whole talk of ambivalence as a human being. It's not a textbook. It's just a deeper dive on ambivalence, but a useful read on how it shapes just us as humans. And Listening Well is his book on empathic understanding. So you will see a lot of all the workshops and things we've discussed in our different journeys together on how to practice those very conversational skills. Um, Not written for clinicians, but just written for human beings. How do I have conversations in my relationships? And that book really addresses that. And I put in a wild card. And I'm careful about this, but I want to put this out because sometimes I've been and gotten feedback. This makes sense in a lot of ways. But man, there are times when you just got to drop those conversational skills and the situation calls for hardcore, head on forcefulness. Don't give me that soft stuff, Ken. There's serious conversations that we have. So, based on that, and I give this with a grain of salt here, this Never Split the Difference book by Chris Voss. He was a hostage negotiator for the FBI. And he wrote a book that the language is tricky because it's about how do you do negotiations when there are hostages, when there are high stakes. People's lives are at stake. I've just been called by the FBI to go overseas to negotiate the release of people that are held in a life and death situation. And he goes through all this. And as you take a journey through there, you see motivational interviewing unfolded out in each chapter. And at the end of his book, there is language like it's not total. Some of the relational components are worded different. So I'm always careful about that. But this is how he ends this book. Sometimes there are conversational conflicts. There are two perspectives. There are two people that have different visions of something. That's part of just interacting. But please remember that our emphasis throughout this book, this hardcore FBI book, is that the adversary is the situation, and that the person you appear to be in conflict with is actually your partner. And the spirit of that in difficult situations, that it's the shared struggle around the situation that's not working. But the person you're actually talking with is your partner in figuring this out. That is his approach going into what seems to be circumstances that you would never think of it that way. But it's just a framework for how these ideas get incorporated in a lot of different ways and are effective. So I just wanted to end on that note and have some time for anything, questions people have. Delia.
Hey, I get sort of not necessarily sort of stuck sometimes, or I guess I have my way of navigating a situation that comes up often when working with partners, where their loved one is their spouse or their partner. And it seems to happen a lot in this kind of situation where the spouse I'm working with really, really wants a declaration of commitment from the loved one. You know, they so badly just want that promise of I'll stay sober and I'll never use again. And I'm sort of curious about how, like in the motivational interviewing stance, especially as we're trying to help, you know, family members apply this, how you might or how they might, you know, help this this family member understand. what's happening. Of course, after doing the reflective statements and that kind of stuff about understanding where the family member's coming from, like how would you navigate that?
Yeah. Hmm. I'm going to answer that probably from a motivational interviewing lens in that spirit. And I might come up short, and let me know if I do, on the handing that baton in teaching. From a practitioner point of view in these trainings, yeah, if pushing for a commitment statement is starting to lead to sustained talk or pushback, those red lights, then when I think about the 4 tasks of MI, I am now in front of where the person is walking. They are now walking behind me. And if I'm tracking that space, at least from that, would be to not stay in the commitment language part, which is we haven't walked, we're not in that zip code right now. So how can I go back to re-engagement? Are we walking together? Where do you want to go? Or do I think about preparatory change talk? Maybe we just stay in, help me understand needs or reasons. And let's talk about cultivating that, because commitment right now doesn't happen from that. So I think it's the flexibility to read the signals and then engage where we are. That, at least from the MI walk, would be, again, a red light, right? If we're going to pull in that from the ITC, and to slow my pace. And that's hard. And to the point, I would imagine, as we talk about family members wanting that, there's a lot of reasons for why it's comforting to hear that, and it's impactful. And in terms of, from my eyes, the willingness and the space to know that we're not there yet, even though we want to be, but can I be open to what I'm feeling during this conversation, or what shows up for me when I'm doing that, and reposition. So I don't know if that answers your question on that. Patricia, thanks for the question.
First, I want to say thanks. This is so incredibly helpful. And I want to follow up a little bit on what Cordelia was asking and taking it a slightly different direction. When someone is stuck in sustained talk for an extended period of time, like months, year, for a long time, do you just stay in the relationship building, or with someone who's deeply stuck in a somewhat precarious, sustainable situation, but doesn't have that motivation to change yet? And if you move forward, they push back. Is the work then just staying in the relationship for as long as possible?
Depending on context, yes, that could be one space where we sit, which is if you don't have if there's no ambivalence there, and again, coming from a motivational interviewing perspective, then my task might switch, which is, can I plant seeds? Mm-hmm. Can I find opportunities to collaborate at offering a different perspective that could plant the seed? It may not generate that, but that would be operating in the relational domain and the engagement domain, while finding opportunities to just plant seeds where motivation or ambivalence can start to grow.
That's really helpful, because I've done ITC with some people whose loved ones are just so deeply, deeply stuck, and trying to encourage that patience to just, that, I don't know if this seems appropriate, but sometimes I wonder if the only work you can do is have the patience to stay in the relationship.
Yeah, I would be aligned with that. And thinking about the ITC, when we think about willingness and values and how do you want to be present, that is some of we could go from a motivational is that's the why for the person who's sitting in the relationship and in the presence of sustained talk.
Excellent. Thank
So,
you.
That's still helping, but it's helping from a perspective of, can I connect with why it's important to me to try to walk with you
Yeah. No, that's super
and be
helpful.
present for that. Now, I will say this as an aside, it's that there is something in a sense called the pendulum effect in motivational interviewing, which is probably not going to fully capture this, but sometimes the fixing reflex could mean I've listened to enough sustained talk and now we move on. And something that two things Steve Rolnick would talk about is the rapid engagement, because often counselors get right to wanting to make change. But if you give people freedom and allow sustained talk to unfold and allow it to carry with its momentum for a period of time, sometimes when it gets exhausted a little bit and it's allowed to just kind of be there, you start to see a softening in it over time. That opens up some opportunities for different ways of collaborating. And that response was just to the fact of, like you're saying, how long do I have to sit and listen to sustained talk? That's going to vary. But sometimes it can be a while until that momentum starts to soften a little bit for a person. But often people's experiences are they're shut down before that's allowed to happen. Because that's not the place people want to be with that. So that's where the engagement and the willingness to stay in can be helpful there.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Susan.
This is really wonderful. I've really enjoyed this. I do have a question. So regarding somebody, so I was working with somebody who had a year of sobriety and then went on a hunting trip, came back, drank while he was on the hunting trip, and determined that he could continue to drink. So is there, in that situation, I was afraid of saying anything that would encourage him to continue to drink. He wasn't planning on continuing to drink, but he kind of felt that he had proven to himself that he could.
Mm-hmm.
So in the conversation, I didn't want to say, oh, so tell me, about what you got from the drinking, or, those are the kinds of questions I asked, but I was really afraid that whatever I said would encourage him to feel like he could continue to do this, or should I not care? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And it's interesting because I go through this talking about how sustained talk doesn't predict change if we think of it empirically. And there are times when people are voicing behaviors, and there's always, and if we're going to step into the MI space, that thought, which is what part of the ambivalence do I want to allowed to give voice to, or do I want to invite in? And that's going to depend in a more nuanced way where I am in the tasks of the conversation. If I feel I'm in refocusing or re-engagement, I certainly want to make room for sustained talk because I want to make sure I'm walking with you. If I'm in the evoking phase, I'm a little less likely to go with you there. So the first response is, where do you want to be in the conversation? What task are you operating from in here? And that will say, how sensitive should I be to sustained talk? The other thing, so there's no violation here that's happening. Sometimes, and this is where, in these trainings, reflective listening can be helpful. If I'm hearing you talk with sustained talk, let me reflect that back to you and see how you respond to that. Drinking makes total sense for you now. Actually, you no longer have concerns for drinking, right? So there are nuances. I can side with the ambivalent side or the sustained side. I can amplify it. There's something interesting when people hear their ambivalence amplified. Sometimes they step back a little bit. So
that's interesting.
You actually have no concerns about drinking anymore. But that is only if the relationship's there. If I say that and a person feels I'm an adversary, we're not going to really talking. But if I'm just reflecting back what I hear you saying, and we're partners here, then where do you want to go with that? That's what I hear you saying. You have no more concerns. Drinking is no longer a concern or no problem. I can walk with you. I can start to see where you're relating with that sustain and that change. So that's how those OR skills are being used in the context of sustain talk, by reflecting it, summarizing it, giving space to see how people respond to hearing themselves talk that way.
That's interesting,
And
because
then,
that's what I did. And then I thought, well, maybe I shouldn't have done that, because was I, acknowledging that he can keep drinking by reflecting back to him that he didn't see a problem with it.
right. And then here's some of the hard parts, I think, with the spirit. And that's why I always go back. I have prompts. I check in with myself on, right? Autonomy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, even if at this point he has the freedom to say, alcohol now is the thing I want. And I can walk with you and reflect your different voices around this, but I know you're going to make the decision. And so I'm not doing, like you're saying, when that gets complicated, is what am I doing? How much responsibility am I here? So I think you're reflecting, is just saying, that's what I hear you saying. And let me see where you go with this.
Okay. Thank you.
And that will tell you where you are perhaps on the task. Are we back to re-engagement, refocusing? Has ambivalence been resolved in the other way now? You know, but in the process, one other thing to say is, if people have voiced the why they wanted to make change, that can always be a question or revisiting. In our previous conversations, these were some of the things you were thinking about.
No,
So,
that's
yeah,
very helpful. Thank you.
sure thing. You're all putting in some late nights. I don't know if there's any final questions. I've kept you a little past what our time was. Oh, I hope tonight at least put a little historical context around where this came from, provided some guidance on what it is in action and how it's pulled together over time, and the practice points behind it. And also, just where it exists outside of MI, and how it's kind of being incorporated in different contexts and arenas. Some of those books are certainly things I would recommend, to see how this idea is being brought into play.